Plainfield, Wisconsin, a small, cold town buried under snow and silence. In the mid-20th century, it was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and neighbors waved from their porches. But behind the weathered barn on a lonely farm just outside town, something unimaginable was growing, a darkness that would one day shock the world. That darkness was Edward Theodore Gein. Born on August 27, 1906, Ed was the second son of George and Augusta Gein. From the start, his life was shaped and scarred by the woman who ruled it, his mother, Augusta Wilhelmine Gein. A towering presence both physically and spiritually, Augusta saw sin everywhere except in her own reflection. She was a woman of rigid faith and harsh morality, obsessed with purity and convinced that all women except herself were the root of evil. Augusta preached to her sons for hours each day. She read them verses from the Old Testament about sin and damnation, warning that the world was full of temptation. "Women," she would say, "are instruments of the devil. They lead men to ruin." To Ed, her words weren't just lessons, they were law. A mother's grip. The Gein family lived first in La Crosse, Wisconsin, where George owned a small grocery store. But George was a weak man, alcoholic, aimless and bitter. Augusta despised him. She saw his drinking as proof of male corruption, and she made sure her sons saw it too. When the family moved in 1915 to a desolate farm on the outskirts of Plainfield, Augusta's control grew absolute. The farm was isolated, no neighbors for miles, no friends for the children. Augusta wanted it that way. She forbade her sons, Henry and Ed, from having contact with outsiders. She told them the world was dangerous, that women were wicked, and that salvation came only through her. Ed listened. He absorbed every word, every command. In school, he was shy and withdrawn. His classmates mocked his soft voice and strange mannerisms. He often laughed at random moments, a nervous, unsettling giggle that made others uneasy. Teachers described him as polite but odd. After class, he went straight home to the farm, where Augusta awaited with her Bible in hand. Augusta's sermons were not gentle lessons. They were warnings of hellfire and sin, a daily dose of fear. She told Ed that even thinking about women was dangerous. "They will corrupt your soul," she would say. To her, the female body represented everything impure except her own. That contradiction would haunt Ed for the rest of his life. The brothers divide. By the 1930s, both sons were adults still living under their mother's roof. George, their father, drank himself deeper into despair and died in 1940 from heart failure. Augusta barely mourned him. She saw his death as divine punishment for his weakness. Henry, the elder brother, began to see their mother differently. He worked outside the farm, made friends, and occasionally spoke with women. He also worried about Ed's dependence on Augusta. "Ed's got this strange attachment to Ma," Henry once told a neighbor. "It ain't right." He tried to convince Ed to see their mother for what she was, controlling, fanatical, abusive. But Ed wouldn't hear it. To him, Augusta was a saint. When Henry criticized her, Ed became furious. Then in May 1944, tragedy struck. A fire broke out near the Gein farm while the brothers were burning brush. When the flames grew out of control, the men separated to fight it. Hours later, only Ed returned. He led police to Henry's body, lying face down on the ground, unburned with bruises on his head. Authorities ruled it an accident, but many in Plainfield whispered otherwise. Some said Ed had killed his brother, the only other person who might have stood between him and Augusta. No one ever proved it. The death was officially listed as asphyxiation. But to the people of Plainfield, something about the story never fit. The last bond. After Henry's death, it was just Ed and Augusta. The two shared an uneasy quiet. She began to suffer from health issues, a series of strokes that left her weak. Ed tended to her day and night. He cooked, cleaned, and read scripture to her bedside. Neighbors saw him as a devoted son. "Such a nice, shy man," they would say. always taking care of his mother. But behind those kind eyes, something else was forming, a mixture of fear, desire, and obsession. Ede's world revolved entirely around Augusta. Her disapproval crushed him. Her praise filled him with pride. Then, on December 29, 1945, Augusta Wilhelmine Gein died. Ede's world shattered. To outsiders, it was simply the passing of a mother. But to Ede, it was the end of his entire reason for living. He later told investigators that when Augusta died, he lost his only friend. The empty house. The farmhouse quickly became a tomb. Ede sealed off Augusta's room, locking it exactly as she had left it, neat, dust-free, untouched. Lace curtains still hung over the windows. Her Bible sat beside her bed. To Ede, it was sacred ground, a shrine to the only woman he ever loved. The rest of the house fell into decay. Food rotted on the counters, junk piled high in the kitchen, dead flies collected on the windowsills. In that growing filth, Ede began to unravel. He spent hours reading pulp horror magazines and anatomy books. He devoured articles about Nazi medical experiments, cannibalism, and death. He was fascinated by the human body, particularly the female form, which he had been taught to fear. At night he sat alone by the oil lamp, staring at pictures of women in magazines. They reminded him of Augusta, and yet not. Voices in the dark. Neighbors sometimes saw lights flickering in the Gein farmhouse late at night. They said they heard voices, not one, but two. Some thought Ede was talking to himself. Others whispered that he was talking to his dead mother. Psychiatrists would later call it schizophrenia, a condition that blurred the line between reality and imagination. To Ede, Augusta wasn't gone. He heard her voice commanding him, guiding him. "She told me to do it," he would later say. But what was it? The descent begins. In the years following Augusta's death, Ede's behavior grew stranger. He took odd jobs around town: handyman, babysitter, farm help. People found him harmless, maybe a little eccentric. He was quiet, polite, and always ready to lend a hand. Children liked him. He told them jokes, showed them tricks, sometimes gave them candy. Adults, however, kept their distance. There was something unsettling about the way he stared, an intensity in his eyes, a kind of blank curiosity. Ede also began visiting the local graveyards at night. He told himself he was just looking, but in reality, he was searching. Searching for women who resembled his mother. He dug up graves, brought home body parts, and began creating things, objects that blurred the line between life and death. Masks made of human skin, furniture upholstered in flesh, skulls turned into bowls. It was his way of rebuilding Augusta, piece by piece. Plainfield's quiet fear. By the early 1950s, people in Plainfield began to whisper. A local tavern owner, Mary Hogan, had vanished without a trace in 1954. Her bar was found empty, with blood on the floor. No one knew what happened to her. When Ede's neighbors mentioned Mary's disappearance, he would smile and say things like, "She's not missing, she's at the house now." Everyone laughed, thinking it was just another of Ede's odd jokes. No one could imagine how literal those words truly were. The Butcher of Plainfield. Ed Gein's story would not explode into national headlines until November 16, 1957, when hardware store owner Bernice Worden disappeared. But the seeds of his madness were sown much earlier in that farmhouse on the lonely Plainfield Road, under the watchful eyes of a mother who taught her son that love was sin, that women were evil, and that salvation required obedience. When Augusta Gein died, she left behind more than an empty house. She left a void in her son that would consume him, and eventually others. Ede's devotion, once twisted by isolation and delusion, was about to erupt into horror. And soon, the small town of Plainfield would learn that the quiet, polite man next door, the one who fixed their fences and watched their kids, was hiding something unspeakable behind his locked doors. The cold wind swept across Plainfield on a gray November morning in 1957. The town was quiet, its people going about their day, unaware that a horror was about to unfold that would change how America saw small towns forever. In the center of town, Bernice Worden's hardware store sat with its lights on and door slightly ajar. It was deer hunting season, and most of the men were out in the woods, but something felt wrong. Bernice's son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, arrived at the store just after sunset. He noticed the cash register open, a pool of dried blood near the counter, and his mother's truck missing. There were drag marks on the floor. Frank's heart sank. The last sales receipt in the register read simply, "Antifreeze Ed Gein." Within hours, police cars surrounded the old Gein farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The place looked deserted, dark except for a single light flickering in a side window. The officers knocked. No answer. They pushed open the door and stepped inside, and what they found there defied every notion of reality they'd ever known. The stench hit them first, an unbearable mix of rot, dampness, and decay. The air was thick, the floor sticky beneath their boots. Dust floated through the light of their flashlights, and every surface seemed coated with grime. They moved slowly, calling out Ed's name, their voices trembling. One of them stumbled over something hanging from the rafters. When the beam of his flashlight moved up, he froze. It was Bernice Worden, her body mutilated and suspended like a deer carcass. She had been decapitated and split open, gutted the way hunters cleaned their kill. Her remains hung upside down in the dark of Ed Gein's shed. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, silence. The officers backed away in shock, then began to search the rest of the house. What they uncovered inside those walls would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There were chairs upholstered with human skin, bowls made from skulls, a lampshade stretched from the face of a woman, fingernails, lips, and noses stored in boxes, masks carefully fashioned from human faces, each one dried, preserved, and arranged neatly as if part of a grotesque collection. On the kitchen table sat a brown paper bag. Inside it was Bernice Worden's head. Her heart lay near the stove. In the next room, police found what looked like a vest, sewn from the torso of a woman. It had breasts attached and could be worn like clothing. Nearby, there were leggings stitched from human skin. Everywhere they turned, there was another horror: human skulls on bedposts, a belt made of nipples, a wastebasket made from flesh. There were even masks with makeup still visible on the skin, lips curled in frozen smiles. Officers later said that no words could describe the scene. One of them vomited outside in the snow. Another wept. None of them would ever forget the sight of Ed Gein's house, the house of horrors, as the newspapers would soon call it. Hours later, they found Ed himself at a neighbor's house. He surrendered quietly, calm and expressionless. He didn't resist when they placed the handcuffs around his wrists. He looked at them with a vacant stare and said, "She's at the house, isn't she?" At the station, detectives questioned him for hours. Ed spoke softly, with that same shy politeness people in town had always known. But the words he said were monstrous. He confessed without emotion. Yes, he had killed Bernice Worden. Yes, he had killed Mary Hogan a few years earlier. And yes, he had been visiting cemeteries at night for years, digging up the corpses of women who reminded him of his mother. He told them he brought the bodies home and used them to make things: furniture, masks, clothing. He claimed that after his mother's death, he began hearing her voice. She would tell him that he needed to find her again, to bring her back. He said he would dig up women who resembled her, older women with strong features, and take their remains home. When asked why, Ed said something that chilled the room to silence. "I wanted to make a suit," he said, "a woman's suit, so I could be her." The officers didn't understand. "Be who?" one asked. "My mother," Ed replied simply. It was that moment that revealed the heart of his madness. Ed Gein didn't just want to keep Augusta alive in memory. He wanted to become her, to crawl into her skin, to feel her presence again in the most literal and horrifying way. Investigators began cataloging what they found in the farmhouse, item by item. The list ran over 200 objects, each one crafted from parts of human bodies. Police photographers captured every detail. The images would later become some of the most disturbing evidence ever recorded in American criminal history. As the news spread, Plainfield changed overnight. Reporters flooded the tiny town, crowding the streets, knocking on doors and demanding answers. They wanted to know how no one had suspected him. How could a man who helped neighbors fix fences and babysat local children live surrounded by death for so long without anyone knowing? Neighbors remembered little things that now seemed ominous. How Ed sometimes laughed inappropriately, how he'd make morbid jokes about missing women, how his eyes would glaze over when someone mentioned his mother. But no one ever thought he was dangerous. They thought he was just odd. In the days after his arrest, the sheriff's department became a media circus. Reporters from Life, Time, and newspapers across the country came to Plainfield. They called him the Butcher of Plainfield. The story made national headlines, and horror filmmakers would soon take inspiration from it. When investigators returned to the farmhouse, they found a room untouched by horror, Augusta's room. It was immaculate, spotless, preserved exactly as she left it in 1945. Her bed was neatly made, her Bible on the nightstand, the curtains drawn tight. The police noted that it was the only clean space in the entire house. To them, it was clear that Augusta was still alive in Ed's mind. Everything else in the house represented his attempts to recreate her, to rebuild her body and spirit out of the dead. Psychiatrists later described Ed's mental state as a complete detachment from reality. He suffered from schizophrenia and severe psychosis, complicated by years of religious fear and isolation. The voices he heard, particularly his mother's, gave him permission for his acts. He believed he was doing something sacred, not sinful. During interrogation, Ed spoke of his grave robbing calmly, almost cheerfully. He said he visited local cemeteries about 40 times, though he only dug up graves on about 9 occasions. He described how he would pick recent burials, read obituaries for older women who reminded him of Augusta, and sneak into graveyards under moonlight. He used a pry bar to open coffins and removed body parts, sometimes taking the whole body. Then he would fill the grave back up to make it appear untouched. The police later verified several disturbed graves in the Plainfield Cemetery, confirming that Ed's confessions were not delusions, they were real. Despite his gruesome actions, Ed claimed he never committed necrophilia in the sexual sense. "I never had intercourse with them," he said softly. "They smelled too bad." But his acts of cutting, stitching, and wearing the skin of others were even more disturbing. He told investigators he would sometimes wear the skin suit around his house, pretending to be a woman, pretending to be Augusta. After several days of questioning, Ed was charged with first-degree murder. He was transferred to the state crime lab in Madison for psychiatric evaluation. There, doctors studied him extensively, trying to understand how such horrors could emerge from one man. They concluded that his obsession with his mother and his deep fear of women combined with mental illness had created a rare and extreme form of psychosis. Meanwhile, back in Plainfield, the farmhouse became a symbol of evil. Crowds gathered daily, hopping to see the place where the unimaginable had happened. People stole pieces of wood and scrap metal as souvenirs. Others came just to stare. Some said they could still smell death in the air even from the road. Eventually, the county ordered that everything inside the house be auctioned. But before that could happen, on March 20, 1958, the farmhouse burned to the ground. Firefighters arrived too late to save it. The flames consumed everything: the walls, the furniture, the evidence of Ed's life. When asked if it was arson, investigators never found proof, but many locals said it was better that way. "Let it burn," one man told the press. "That house was never meant to stand." All that remained of the Gein property was a blackened foundation and a rusting mailbox that still bore the name Ed Gein. After the fire, Ed showed little emotion. When told his house was gone, he simply said, "Just as well." As the investigation continued, Ed was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial. He was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. There, doctors described him as quiet, polite, and cooperative. He read books, did chores, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Nurses said he never caused trouble. To them, he seemed almost childlike. But even behind hospital walls, the legend of Ed Gein continued to grow. Journalists published lurid stories. Magazines printed exaggerated details about cannibalism and black magic. Some of it was true, much of it wasn't, but the world couldn't look away. The man from Plainfield had become something larger, a living symbol of horror. As the years went on, Gein's crimes became the foundation for some of the most famous horror characters in American culture. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and later The Silence of the Lambs, all drew inspiration from him. Each took pieces of his real life, the overbearing mother, the flesh masks, the isolated farmhouse, and turned them into enduring nightmares on film. But for the people of Plainfield, it wasn't fiction. It was memory. Some residents refused to speak of it ever again. Children who had once waved to Ed on the street grew up haunted by the thought that the quiet man who helped their parents could have worn someone else's face. By the time Ed was settled into his life inside the mental institution, Plainfield had returned to uneasy quiet. The road to his old property became overgrown. Locals avoided it. Only the wind moved through the empty fields, carrying with it the memory of what once lived there. When psychiatrists visited Ed years later, they described him as calm and strangely content. He never expressed guilt or remorse in the traditional sense. When asked about Bernice Worden or Mary Hogan, he would simply nod and say, "They're all with Ma now." He seemed to believe he had done nothing wrong. In his mind, his acts were not murders but a kind of restoration, bringing his mother's image back to life in fragments. To the world, Ed Gein was a monster. But inside his fractured mind, he was a son trying to keep his mother from leaving him again. After the brutal discovery of Bernice Worden's dismembered body and the grotesque remains found within Ed Gein's farmhouse, the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, was forever changed. It was as though the earth itself had opened up and revealed something ancient and terrible beneath, the secret life of a quiet, seemingly harmless man who had walked among them for years. What investigators uncovered was not merely a murder scene, but a museum of horror, one that blurred the boundaries between the living and the dead, sanity and delusion, man and monster. Inside the Gein farmhouse, police officers stood frozen in disbelief. Lampshades stitched from human skin, chairs upholstered with flesh, skulls turned into bowls, and masks crafted from the faces of women, all meticulously arranged in his dimly lit home. Each object seemed to whisper of the countless nights Ed had spent cutting, stitching, and rearranging the dead into a vision of life that existed only in his mind. To him, these grotesque creations were not trophies of violence, but desperate attempts to recreate the warmth and presence of his long-dead mother, Augusta. As investigators delved deeper, they discovered how methodical Ed's actions had been. He confessed that most of his victims were not murdered but exhumed from graves. He prowled local cemeteries at night, his lantern flickering among the headstones, choosing the freshly buried bodies of women who, in some way, resembled Augusta. He would dig them up, load them onto his truck, and bring them back to the farmhouse. Once there, he performed rituals of preservation, cleaning the bodies, carving skin, removing bones, and crafting objects that, to him, seemed sacred. He spoke of these actions not with malice, but with eerie calmness, as if they were acts of devotion. When psychiatrists later questioned him, Ed claimed that he never felt sexual desire toward his victims. Instead, he said he felt compelled, driven by a need to become his mother, to inhabit her essence, to feel her guidance again. The woman suit he constructed, pieced together from the skin of multiple corpses, was meant to let him become Augusta, even if only for moments. It was a form of communion with the woman who had shaped his entire view of life, death, and morality. The psychological community would later call this behavior psychotic transference. His mind, fractured by years of isolation, trauma, and schizophrenia, had twisted grief into obsession. To Ed, death was not an end but a way back, a means to bridge the unbearable gap left by Augusta's passing. He told doctors that after her death, he heard her voice calling him, urging him to make her proud, to cleanse the world of sinful women. Throughout his life in Plainfield, people described Ed as strange but not dangerous. He did odd jobs, babysat for neighbors, and even repaired farm equipment. He was polite, quiet, and seemingly harmless, the kind of man you wouldn't look at twice in a grocery store. That facade was what made his crimes even more chilling. Beneath the mild exterior lived a man whose imagination had decayed into a nightmare. When his crimes finally came to light in 1957, the media exploded. Headlines screamed of the Butcher of Plainfield and the Ghoul. Reporters from across the country descended upon the small farming community. Plainfield, once an anonymous dot on the map, became synonymous with horror. Journalists interviewed locals who recalled Ed's strange smile, his quiet laughter, and how he often spoke of his poor mother. Some remembered that he rarely looked anyone in the eyes, as though he were always listening to someone else, someone unseen. Ed's trial and the investigation that followed captivated America. For the first time, the public was exposed to the disturbing psychology of a man whose crimes seemed too bizarre to be real. But the fascination was mixed with revulsion. How could such atrocities come from a man who looked so ordinary? What darkness lingered within human nature that could produce someone like Ed Gein? During his psychiatric evaluation, doctors diagnosed him with chronic schizophrenia and necrophilia, coupled with deep-rooted delusion stemming from religious guilt and maternal domination. His mother's teachings about purity and sin had carved deep grooves in his mind. Augusta had taught him that women, except for herself, were instruments of the devil. To love them was to invite damnation, but to destroy them, perhaps, was to serve God. In court, Ed was quiet and compliant. He answered questions in a soft voice, never showing anger or remorse. He seemed confused when journalists shouted questions at him. "Why did you do it, Ed?" they asked. He would sometimes smile faintly and say, "She told me to." To him, it was never murder, it was obedience. The courtroom was packed the day the verdict was announced. Reporters, families of victims, and townspeople all gathered, waiting to hear if justice would be done. When the judge declared him not guilty by reason of insanity, there was a stunned silence. Many wanted him executed, believing that death was the only way to repay his crimes. But the court ruled that Ed was not in control of his mind, that he was as much a victim of his illness as the people he had harmed. He was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin, and later transferred to the Mendota Mental Health Institute, where he would spend the rest of his life. There he lived quietly, often described by staff as polite and cooperative. He spent his days reading, drawing, and working in the hospital's maintenance department. To his fellow patients, he was Eddie, a mild-mannered, soft-spoken man who never caused trouble. The horrors of his past seemed to exist in another world. But for the outside world, Ed Gein's story had only just begun. His crimes became the foundation for a new era of horror in American culture. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho introduced Norman Bates, a shy, mother-obsessed motel owner who killed women while dressed as his dead mother. The character was directly inspired by Ed Gein. Later came the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, with its villain Leatherface who wore masks of human skin, and The Silence of the Lambs, 1991, whose killer Buffalo Bill crafted a woman's suit, both reflections of Gein's nightmarish reality. Each film reimagined his crimes in a different form, turning Ed into a myth, the American monster born not from hate, but from love twisted into madness. Filmmakers, psychologists, and writers would continue to dissect his story, searching for meaning in his darkness. Was he evil, insane, or merely the tragic result of isolation and indoctrination? In the mental institution, Ed's days blended together. He rarely spoke about his crimes, but occasionally mentioned his mother in gentle tones. He would talk about her as if she were still alive, as though she might walk through the door any moment to praise him for keeping his faith. Staff noted that he showed no signs of aggression and appeared content in his confinement. It was as if, within those walls, he finally found the peace that had eluded him all his life. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure at the age of 77. There was no public funeral. Only a small handful of people attended his burial beside his family in Plainfield Cemetery, the same cemetery where he had once dug up the bodies of women who reminded him of Augusta. Over the years, his gravestone became a site of macabre fascination. Visitors chipped away pieces of it as souvenirs, until it was finally removed to prevent further vandalism. Even decades after his death, the fascination with Ed Gein continues. His name has become shorthand for the unimaginable, the man who lived in a decaying farmhouse surrounded by the echoes of death, who turned grief into monstrosity. Yet behind the sensational headlines and horror movies lies a profoundly human tragedy. A boy raised in isolation by a mother who taught him to fear the world, only to lose her and lose himself entirely. Augusta's influence never truly left him. Her teachings, her judgment, her presence, all became ghosts haunting his mind until his final breath. In a way, Ed Gein's entire life was a love story, though one so distorted it became unrecognizable. A son's endless yearning for the approval of a mother who could never be pleased, even from beyond the grave. In the years since his passing, psychologists have continued to study Ed's case as one of the most disturbing examples of psychosis born from repression and emotional dependency. His crimes were not driven by lust or greed, but by an attempt to fill an emotional void, to undo loss through creation. The skin suits, the masks, the preserved room, all were manifestations of a heart broken beyond repair. Today, the Gein farmhouse no longer exists. It was destroyed by fire in 1958, under suspicious circumstances, just before it was scheduled to be auctioned. Some say it was arson, an act of revenge or shame by locals who couldn't bear the idea of anyone owning that cursed place. Only ashes and memories remain, but the legend endures. True crime enthusiasts, horror fans, and scholars continue to revisit his story. They search through police files, photographs, and interviews, trying to understand what created Ed Gein. But perhaps the true answer lies not in what he did, but in what he believed. To him, death was not the end. It was transformation. It was the only way to keep his mother's world alive. And so, Ed Gein, the quiet farmer from Wisconsin, became the embodiment of America's darkest fears. A man who walked the line between grief and madness, faith and depravity. His crimes gave birth to a genre, inspired countless films, and forced society to confront an unsettling truth. Monsters are not born in the shadows. They are shaped in homes, by hands that once nurtured and words that once preached love. Ed Gein's story remains a haunting mirror, one that reflects not just his twisted devotion, but the fragile line between devotion and destruction. His life was a descent into obsession, and his crimes,